I think we can start. Just a couple of words in Italian and then I switch to English. Buongiorno a tutti e benvenuti a questo appuntamento dei nostri seminari su estetica, biologia e biodiversità. Il ciclo di seminari è parte di un progetto di ricerca che sto portando avanti con un collega del Dipartimento di Biologia, Leonardo Dapporto. Si tratta di un progetto di ricerca che indaga la dimensione estetica nelle strategie di conservazione delle specie a rischio. Questo è il titolo del progetto di ricerca che andrà avanti quest'anno e il prossimo anno. Now I switch to English. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is the sixth seminar in a series of seminars that we are carrying out here in Florence in the frame of a project that I'm carrying out with a colleague from the Department of Biology. This is the title of the project, and the project aims at unveiling, assessing, and taking advantage of the aesthetic dimension in conservation practices, with a particular focus on butterflies, European butterflies, as a case study. So more in general is a project that moves on the boundary between aesthetics and humanities more broadly, and biological and environmental sciences. And this series of seminars is intended to give us different perspectives on this question of the interaction between philosophy, aesthetics, and the natural and environmental sciences. Today, we are very, very happy to have with us Professor Emily Brady. I will say a couple of things about her. I'm very happy to have Emily here with us this afternoon. Professor Emily Brady is Professor of Philosophy at Texas A&M University. And before being appointed at Texas A&M, she was Professor of Environment and Philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. Research and teaching interests span aesthetics and philosophy of art, environmental ethics, 18th century philosophy, with a special focus on the notion of the sublime and the environmental humanities and animal studies. And so her philosophical approach tries to combine the history of aesthetics, so past thinking about nature, environment, and the arts, with contemporary issues in aesthetics and the arts. She has published 7 books. I just want to mention here a couple of them: Between Nature and Culture, The Aesthetics of Modifying Environments in 2018, The Sublime in Modern Philosophy, 2013, and Human-Environment Relations, Transformative Values in Theory and Practice in 2018. As said, I'm very happy to have Emily here, although I see now that there are some problems with the internet connections, because actually I do not see Emily anymore. And I hope that she will. Okay, Emily, can you hear me? Oh my God. Oh. Okay. Now I can see you. Is everything okay with your connection? All right. Okay. Perhaps we have to wait couple of minutes, because it seems that her internet connection is not particularly stable. Oh. Okay. Okay, great. Okay.
But it'll just take me a moment, please. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay. So I will try to entertain you for another couple of minutes, waiting for Professor Brady to be again with us. And the title of the presentation today is Aesthetics, Climate Change, a Philosophical Approach on questions of philosophical investigation into the new challenges that climate change and the ecological crisis pose to present to philosophers and aestheticians. Okay. I think that in a moment we will be back with us. Okay, I'll just give you, in the meantime, a couple of technical notes. Of course, after the presentation, we will have a question and answers session. And it's very easy if you're not familiar with WebEx, which is the software that we are currently using now. It's very easy. You can see there is a list of participants on the right side of the screen. You can find your own name in the list. Just click on your own name and you will find a small icon with a hand, and you can just click on the hand, and after the presentation, that's the way you can book your time for asking a question to Professor Brady. Okay, great. Yeah.
All righty, is that better?
Okay. Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, good.
Great. Okay. As said, we are super happy. We're very happy to have you here for your talk on aesthetics, ecology, and climate change, a philosophical approach. And the floor is yours. Thank you, Emily, for accepting our invitation. And please. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Maria Grazia, for this invitation, and what a wonderful project it sounds like you're embarking on there. I'd love to hear more about it sometime, and wonderful to see the audience as well. I'm going to. Sorry about the technical difficulties. Fortunately, I'm downstairs now. That should be a little closer to our router, and so hopefully it'll be better. But at least you get to see a lovely picture of a lapwing there with some chicks, which is probably what we might see going on in Scotland right now. Perhaps the lapwing now have their young, and are here in Texas we have owlets, new baby owls in the owl box in the yard, so it's quite something to watch them every day. Okay, yeah, so from Texas to Florence. I'm going to share my screen now with my slides. Okay, so again, thank you so much for this invitation. When I was thinking about the talk for this wonderful seminar series, I have already been writing about aesthetics and global climate change, and I know there's at least a couple of people in the audience who've heard that talk already. And so I wanted to try to do something that moves forward with that paper. And that paper was called Global Climate Change and Aesthetics, and it's forthcoming. And in that paper, what I do is to argue for a new research agenda for philosophical aesthetics in light of global climate change. And I make a case for that based on the idea that other parts of philosophy have really taken up the issue of climate change. And but aesthetics has been a little bit slow. So that paper sets up a new research agenda. So what I thought I would do in this talk is to think about my own theory, my own environmental aesthetic theory, and whether it really meets some of the demands that I that I set out in this new research agenda, which I propose in that paper, which is forthcoming. So I'm going to take my theory of the integrated aesthetic, and I'm going to ask to what extent it's still relevant for thinking through problems, great, huge, global, intergenerational problems, emergencies, such as climate change, but also I'd be interested in another paper to think about how it addresses um, problems such as mass extinctions. I won't be covering that kind of thing here. And I'm also going to look at how I can revise the theory of the integrated aesthetic in order to capture intergenerational issues and the state of the planet in light of the climate emergency and, of course, the Anthropocene. Essentially, I'm going to subject my own theory to my own critique, which I think is important. So let me just give a brief overview of environmental aesthetics. It emerged as a subfield in aesthetics and philosophy. That's the context in which I'm going to be talking about environmental aesthetics within the field of philosophy. It certainly emerged in the late 1960s in Europe. Finland has a really rich tradition of environmental aesthetics, and that's happening more in other parts of Europe now. Also in the UK, in North America, in both the United States and Canada, but also in places like China and Japan. And environmental aesthetics really at its heart tries to argue that our experience and appreciation of environment is not principally guided by artistic conventions or framings. So it's trying to move on from many 18th century ideas in Western philosophy around scenic landscapes and perceiving landscapes as if they were paintings through the theory of the picturesque and other 18th century, 19th century ideas. And environmental aesthetics makes a shift, tries to understand aesthetic appreciation, valuing, in relation to a more multisensory, situated, and immersive context, where a whole set of new possibilities present themselves in terms of our aesthetic attention. And also recognizes, importantly, how much environments, ecologies, places are all dynamic and changing from moment to moment, from hour to hour, from day to day, for all kinds of different kinds of reasons. Weather changes, seasonal changes, but just also creatures coming in and out of our aesthetic situations, such as this lovely chestnut-headed bee-eater, and listening to the song of the bee-eater as it comes and goes. Importantly, also, environmental aesthetics relates to non-instrumental valuing. And this is, of course, at the heart of environmental ethics, too, when we look at philosophical ideas. So many philosophers of environmental aesthetics have really argued for the importance of understanding aesthetic value as an intrinsic or a non-instrumental value, where environment, place, ecologies are appreciated for their own sake, on their own terms. Well, I'd also like to mention how aesthetic value has, again, been theorized by philosophers as being in contrast to other kinds of values, such as economic value or even recreational value. And I also just wanted to mention, of course, that there's some very interesting and important overlaps between work in environmental aesthetics and work in everyday aesthetics. And the philosopher Yuriko Saito is perhaps best known for working in both of these areas and showing how they overlap. So certainly, I think it helps us to remember that environmental aesthetics is not only about wild places, places that are remote for some people, but also about our everyday experiences of place and environment. Something that perhaps has become particularly important for people during the pandemic, given particular forms of lockdown and isolation. All right, where am I? So the integrated aesthetic I introduced in a book in 2003. And in that book, I argue for a non-cognitive theory of environmental aesthetics, which incorporates a plurality of features of our aesthetic experience. So senses and perception, emotions, knowledge, imagination, and of course the ways in which these different features of our lived aesthetic experience are going to interact. And I set it up in contrast to what's called now in the field scientific cognitivism. Alan Carlson is a proponent, perhaps the main proponent of this position, and well known for arguing for this, which tends to take a narrower view. The senses and perception are at the heart of aesthetic experience, but scientific knowledge is an important, very important way of grounding our aesthetic experiences on this particular kind of position. So non-cognitive theories are in contrast to that. Now, why do I call it the integrated aesthetic? Well, for one reason, I want to capture the relationality of aesthetic experience. And I do that by really emphasizing both the situation of the aesthetic subject, the appreciator, and the situation of the aesthetic data, which will guide environmental appreciation. And by aesthetic data, I mean just sort of everything. It's very hard to capture that. And it's perhaps a better way than using the term object, which doesn't work so well across disciplines. And integrated is meant to underscore how aesthetic appreciation involves a relationship between the appreciator and the environment. It captures the environing experience as places surround us and the natural aspects of that place, ecological aspects that change the dynamism of a particular place as it surrounds the appreciator, or indeed a community of appreciators, as opposed to, again, only appreciating landscape from a distance as if we were observing a scene or a painting. And it also attempts to capture all the possible kinds of aesthetic relations, and that these can occur through our different kinds of multisensory engagement with environment, participating and interacting with what it is that we're surrounded by, or the setting. I have here on the right just an image of a seaweed farmer because I thought it might capture, to me, what's important also to remember in environmental aesthetics, that it's not just the rarefied appreciator, but it's also working relationships with the land, with the sea, and so on. And here I try to imagine what the seaweed farmer might be experiencing in terms of smells, the wind, the weather, the sun, the feeling of the sun, excuse me, all the while working quite hard through the day. More recently, what I've tried to do is develop this idea of relationality a little bit more robustly, and I've done that through Alan Holland's idea of meaningful relationships between humans and ecologies. And meaningful relationships are to me, really an interesting concept, because it tries to articulate, based on environmental ethics, of environmental pragmatism, but also narrative-based theories of environmental ethics, and also virtue-based theories of ethics. Pardon me. And what I like about this idea is that it really captures a place-based aesthetic relations, and also allows for both positive and negative aesthetic relationships, remembering that aesthetics is not simply about a positive aesthetic values, that there are many different kinds of our experiences of the world that will not be positive at all. And Holland's idea of meaningful relationships captures that. So why integrated? Also, I want to emphasize the role of change. So, again, I mentioned a variety of reasons and factors, meteorological, geological, place-based, related to the movement of creatures, the change of seasons, change of weather, and so on. And this will bring new things for us to aesthetically appreciate, comings and goings, changes in light, in wind, in temperature. And in a place like the UK where I used to live, the weather certainly gave us that, and it actually created an incredible amount of aesthetic interest. And it's actually also true here where I live now. The weather changes in Texas can be quite dramatic too. But there's also this sense in which the aesthetic situation reflects the complexity of environmental appreciation, where we might think of that as not this static or immovable experience, but one that's more like a happening. And that happening creates the conditions of an aesthetic situation. But I've recognized that the integrated aesthetics really needs to think about longer timescales. And I've been motivated certainly by understanding something about climate change, but also motivated by some really interesting work in other disciplines around geological aesthetics, around thinking to do with the Anthropocene, and thinking in relation to deep time. So that really we need to start thinking about an intergenerational temporality when it comes to aesthetics, if we're actually really going to capture fully the kind of aesthetic data that we're experiencing. Thinking about modeling changes into the future and how that kind of modeling and use of imagination too will play an important role as we move forward. But I also want to note how much changes can occur for the aesthetic subject, for the valuer or the community, as their situation shifts and changes. I think this is important in any environmental aesthetic experience, or indeed any aesthetic experience. But of course, it will also become important as the places that we live in change due to global warming. And I just wanted to start with the image there on the bottom. This is an image from Austin, Texas, of the winter storm that we had in February, which was a really awful, awful occurrence. I could go on and tell you about it. It was an awful occurrence as an extreme weather event for Texas, which is essentially at the latitude of Morocco. If that gives you where I live, that gives you a little bit of some context. So this week-long snow and freeze led to human deaths, led to the loss of many species. There's a hard, firm evidence of human deaths caused by this freeze, and the state of Texas's complete collapse of their electricity grid due to poor governance, but also anecdotal evidence of species loss and the loss of many plants that we know so far. So some real changes, and this is there is some speculation. I think the science is still, there's all of that discussion about it, but about how the polar vortex may be now dipping further south, and this may be why we can expect such extreme weather events like this to happen, let alone the frequency of hurricanes that will be affecting the coast not far from where I live. And simply the image at the top is one of my students many years ago when I used to team teach a field course in Iceland with some human geographers. And here I think it's a really interesting image of a situated multisensory experience, but also one that's situated within a basalt geology of Iceland. And Iceland's an incredible place in terms of new and old geology and geology that's evolving, its landscape and geomorphology evolving very quickly. Sorry, I'm losing, there we go. I also want to emphasize the pluralistic aspect of the integrated aesthetic, but it's also an aspect of the integrated aesthetic that I've tried to make more explicit, and an aspect of the integrated aesthetic that I think really needs a much more work. Certainly the integrated aesthetic in its pluralistic sort of features does share much with other pluralistic non-cognitive theories that we find in environmental aesthetics by Ronald Hepburn, by Arnold Berliant, Yuriko Saito, and Ronald Moore, certainly. And these pluralistic theories really embrace the variety of features of aesthetic experience, senses, perception, emotion, imagination, knowledge, to a greater extent, lesser extent, depending on the theory, but also recognize at the same time the importance of perhaps not a hard objectivity, but recognizing the difference between a trivial and a serious, in Hepburn's terms, aesthetic experience. So the importance of nonetheless avoiding uncritical anthropomorphizing or the forms of sentimentalizing and trivializing, which don't really give us an appreciation of the natural world on its own terms. But I think many theories, also mine in particular and some others, really need to think more carefully about how global aesthetic traditions can be brought more firmly into environmental aesthetic thinking. And that can be done, some of us already draw on Saito's wonderful work, but there's a lot of other work out there, I think, that really needs some more attention. Chinese environmental aesthetics has really been blossoming. And there's also some older work in Indian aesthetics of nature, and I'd be really interested to hear more about that. So now I just want to go through each of these different features that lie really at the center of the lived experience as the integrated aesthetic theorizes it. And starting with sympathetic attention, the senses, and perception. So I originally emphasized the notion of sympathetic attention, which is a kind of common idea in aesthetic theory, in philosophy, through the notion of disinterestedness, because my theory was influenced, or continues to be influenced, certainly by Immanuel Kant, the 18th century philosopher's aesthetic theory, but also by Ronald Hepburn's theory, and also John Dewey, among others. And but now disinterestedness is, even though I offer in the book some years ago now, almost 20 years ago, a reconstructed notion of it, it still remains pretty contested. So I'm trying to leave it behind now and really focusing on the idea of sympathetic attention, partly because of some new work I've been doing on the idea of aesthetic humility. But I do think that sympathetic attention is a useful concept. It emphasizes a particular positioning of the aesthetic appreciator, where we are strongly focused on the qualities and meanings of some everyday happening, landscape, garden, so on, and where our attention is directed outwards, away from ourselves, at the world beyond ourselves, instead of being concerned with our own preoccupations. And this isn't to say I want to erase the features of the aesthetic subject and who they are, their own values and beliefs, not at all, but remembering really that aesthetic attention is, as it's conceived and theorized, it's really a kind of attention that's directed outwards. And the role of knowledge too. Across environmental aesthetics, we find different kinds of knowledge that have been discussed as important to feeding into our aesthetic valuing. And certainly Carlson has developed his scientific cognitivism with a really important discussion of how different forms of common sense and natural historical knowledge, ecology, geology, now these days atmospheric sciences, certainly in relation to climate change, and also some cultural knowledge. Many different philosophers talk about the importance of local knowledge of places, but I think that non-cognitive theories also have been talking more about indigenous forms of knowledge and place-based knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge. And certainly the integrated aesthetic can incorporate this in much more. And that's something I've been trying to do through some of my work on aesthetics and climate change. But I'm really in the early days on that. But also across environmental aesthetics, the recognition of the narratives of stories, of folklore, of myths, of cosmologies, at least within non-cognitive theories, and such as my own, certainly turn to these other kinds of narratives to feed into and deepen and enrich our aesthetic engagement with environment and enable us to discover new meanings. And I do think that these varieties of knowledge and narratives really more important than ever, given that we again are really faced with a global problem when it comes to climate change. And in that respect, we need to think much more globally. And I have here just an image of a very influential book, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who describes herself as a mother, a scientist, she's a botanist, a decorated professor, and an enrolled member of the citizen Potawatomi Nation. I don't know if you've read it, but it's a wonderful book, as well as her other book on mosses. And here, an image of Ronald Hepburn, someone who was a mentor and an important person to me, sadly passed away many years ago, but very influential in the field of environmental aesthetics. And I want to read this quote because I think what he does is to really get across how science and other disciplines can both have a role to play in our aesthetic experiences. He says, the aesthetic mode of experience, the development of which is a very different enterprise indeed from that of science, far from admitting a nisus to leave the subjective, human perceptual, evaluative, and emotional experience, seeks to explore and intensify it, and crucially the aesthetic experience of nature, notably of landscape, is a prime means of enriching, enhancing, increasing our powers of discrimination as members of that life world, a world which has as great a claim to reality as the objective world of this physicist. Some thought elements concerning the geological past of the region we contemplate, some thought of the ecological unity of its plants and animals may well enter and enhance our experience. But we are under no rational imperative to allow the scientific to displace the human perspective or to play down the centrality of that perspective to any experience that can be called aesthetic. And to that end, I'd like to say something about descriptive aesthetics. And I did say something about this in my paper on global climate change and aesthetics. I borrowed this notion from Arnold Berliant, another well-known environmental philosopher. And he describes descriptive aesthetics as accounts of art and aesthetic experience that may be partly narrative, partly phenomenological, partly evocative, and sometimes even revelatory, found most often as parts of other kinds of writing, criticism, philosophical aesthetics. And here I have on the right some literature, nonfiction from Amitav Ghosh, The Great Derangement, in which he argues the importance of literature to thinking the unthinkable about climate change, and a novel by Sherry Smith about New Orleans and the effects of hurricanes there. That's a cli-fi, an example of cli-fi, climate fiction. And then Barbara Kingsolver's also important book, Flight Behavior. And certainly I know that Berliant does intend to discuss the range of the arts and the role that they can play in our aesthetic theorizing, but also in our lived aesthetic experiences. But I'd like to just emphasize that broad range: the environmental and ecological arts, music, the visual arts, performance art, eco-criticism, and cli-fi. Now, I think that descriptive aesthetics is going to have a larger role to play if we're really going to capture the aesthetic qualities, meanings, and values of a world and parts of the world that we're losing, a world that's changing rapidly, and also to imagine the different possibilities of our global futures. That is certainly a role that aesthetics has, and descriptive aesthetics can be incorporated to help us in those imaginative journeys. We're not going to have access to future generations, so we need the resources, and these are aesthetic resources that as philosophers can help us think through these questions theoretically, but also again in terms of how these sources come into our lived aesthetic experiences. In philosophical terms, they can serve as examples in our discussions, as case studies, as empirical data, and also as intuition pumps, a term that philosophers have used to get us thinking and working on problems and issues. Now, how do we bring the descriptive aesthetics into the integrated aesthetic? Well, the way that Berliant puts it is that he talks about how this acute observation with compelling language can encourage the reader toward vivid aesthetic encounters. It shares with criticism a normative interest, not, however, in its interpretive and judgmental modes, but crucially, those are my words, and my emphasis here, in recognizing the central place of aesthetic appreciation and in leading the reader toward such experience. Now, we have to remember, too, that let's bring these passages back to what it is that we're appreciating. These are not, quote, merely self-indulgent effusions, but serious attempts to enlarge the understanding of the aesthetic domain by guiding our perception through it. Again, so these may be some fantastic imaginings, but they have a kind of aesthetic purpose. And the role of imagination, of course, is going to play a role here too, helping to capture some of the ways in which we can imagine our world and understand our world in light of climate change. And the different kinds of stories that will be told and the different kinds of narratives that will be relevant. So I want to give an example of, I suppose, how I'm using descriptive aesthetics. I had the delight of meeting the artist Devorah Newmark through one of my talks. One of the good things about Zoom is incredible people that you can meet. And so I wanted to talk to you about her Letters to the Ice project. Here's her artist statement. White and brilliant crystalline blue are the colors most often associated with ice, at least up here in the Arctic. When in August 2015 I first launched my related participatory art project, Letters to the Water, during which I collected and then read letters from around the world about and to water, I did so acknowledging the 1 million gallons of mine wastewater that had just breached a wall at the Gold King mine near Silverton, Colorado, which made its way along the San Juan River, impacting the Navajo Nation, hundreds of farmers, and the entire local ecosystem, and also acknowledging the water protectors in the Asheti-Shakowin camp who took a stand in solidarity to halt the completion of the Dakota Access Pipeline. Now living as I do, she says, in Iqaluit, place of many fish, in Inuktitut, she can pronounce that much better than I can, the eastern Arctic capital city of Nunavut and Inuit Nunavut, homeland of the Inuit. I'm expanding this project to focus specifically on ice, especially given about the increasingly alarming rate of the state of ice around the world. And here's a couple some information about her, but also the website for this new project, Letters to the Ice, which I really encourage you to visit. There are some extremely moving letters that I've so far posted there or presented there on this wonderful website. And here's one of them from a gentleman in Nairobi in Kenya. Ice is, for me, ice is something good. I will relate to one of our communities. We believe that God resided in the ice, in one of the mountains, in Mount Kenya, where the ice was, where the first man and the first woman were created. So I feel like ice is a kind of God. It's kind of a nature. It controls the world like destiny. It's connected. If you see the ice in the North Pole, when it melts, the sea rises. It controls everything. So ice, I feel like for me, it's God. It's water. It's life. It's healing. It quenches your thirst. It's something really, really, really powerful. And from here we relate with ice, like up in the mountain, the highest place. And ice is situated in the place where we also try to relate in terms of problems. Like we say, quote, you are as tall as the mountain you climb, quote, and you find ice is there. So ice is, it's life. Here we are excited about ice. I remember a few years ago it iced in one area of Nairobi, in the outside of Nairobi. It's a spectacle that we are wowed with. It's something that we've never seen here. So we really treasure it. We treasure it. Even my first relationship with ice, I remember it was in Scandinavia. Ice was melting, and I was out in the snow, in the ice, in the place of ice. And also sometimes it used to rain like hailstorms, whereby it was ice, and we were fascinated about it. But it no longer rains the hailstorms, the ice pebbles. So there is danger within our climate. And we need to restore our world, and we need to restore our ice. As I said, I find these letters to the ice very moving. I encourage you to read them. And this was from a conversation with Don Titi Namai, from Deborah Newmark's project Letters to the Ice. So emotions. The integrated aesthetic really does also try to capture the affective dimension of aesthetic experiences of environment and place, and certainly the range of emotions, not the mere pleasure or displeasure that has been discussed so frequently in early theories of early theories of aesthetics in the 18th century. We can talk about delight and the uplifting feelings related to beauty, to wonder, to fascination. We can think about the shock and the fear and the amazement of the sublime and aesthetic awe. But we can also talk about the grief and the sadness and the disgust and the guilt in the face of massive losses to biodiversity, to habitat, to species, to land, and to water. And going forward, I think the integrated aesthetics can do a lot more work on emotions, the role of emotions. It will need to connect with cross-disciplinary work, and there's a rich area now discussing, for example, ecological grief and also radical hope. We should also be thinking about intergenerational emotions. Again, grief, guilt, anger, indifference perhaps too, but also, well, desperation and also hope. Hope that may come through adaptation and through forms of mitigation and through perhaps positive change. In order to illustrate integrated aesthetic and emotions and thinking about intergenerational thinking, I recently interviewed a glaciologist, and I'm trying to incorporate interviews a little bit more into my work as a way of trying to bring empirical data into aesthetics in a more concerted way, but also in a way that expresses, again, a variety of different kinds of aesthetic narratives of place. So in this interview with a glaciologist, someone who I already knew, this glaciologist worked for many years doing fieldwork on the Haute Durola Glacier in Switzerland, first starting in the summers in 1989, and then doing more work in 1990. And this glaciologist recounted those years and many of the different emotions that were experienced. The camaraderie of fieldwork was a really interesting point that he made, but also elation, wonder, excitement, and sometimes fear because of the summer storms that they would be exposed to during their fieldwork. But on a more recent visit, he talked about the loss, the sadness, the frustration, and the shock as he witnessed how much the glacier had receded due to global warming. And he's told me that it was like visiting a dying relative who's wasting away. And you do find accounts like this from glaciologists, and indeed there have been held rituals, performative funerals for glaciers, a handful of them that I've read about across the world. These images show the loss of the glacier here, of the Bas Durola, and an older map showing the extent of the glacier at the top, a Landsat images from 1985 and 2015, showing how the glacier has receded. If you look at the red arrow there, you'll see that now there's no glacier there. And then the picture on the right showing that the glacier ends further up the mountain, and so that the glacier does no longer reach the valley. That's a Google Earth image on the right showing glacial melt. So I wanted to talk a little bit about imagination as well, and that will be my last few slides. And I did talk about a variety of imaginative types of imaginative activity in my 2003 book. And I do want to revisit this because I think that both two forms of imagination can play an especially important role. But let me just tell you more generally about it. I argue in the book that imaginative activity can generate a participatory, even an embodied aesthetic response. So for example, to appreciate the aesthetic qualities of a snowdrop, a flower which blooms in late winter in Scotland and other parts of the world too, through projective imagination, I can try to imagine what it's like to live and grow under difficult conditions, bringing my own experience of this change from winter and spring to bear on to this kind of sense of seasonal change. Now, imagination provides tools, I argue, to more deeply appreciate the remarkable toughness which seems to be at odds with what I perceive to be the delicate beauty of this flower. Indeed, it's something that many of us can experience every time in late winter, and it is a good harbinger of spring. But I want to think about, again, how I can develop the integrated aesthetic in ways that are more in conversation with our current problems. So what ways can the forms of ampliative and revelatory imagination enable us to think about future aesthetics, to think more intergenerationally through the incredible possibilities and power in which imagination can present. So with respect to ampliative imagination, as I articulated it, involves the inventive powers of imagination. And it doesn't have to make use of images. We think of imagination in our head, as these images coming into our head. But of course, we can also bring in a thought and memories and different ways in which our imagination can again interact with these other mental powers that we have. And ampliative imagination has this more creative and special curiosity. It amplifies what's given in perception and can function to envisage beyond what we see, to changes in the landscape, changes in a glacial valley, changes due to reintroductions or to rewilding or to ecological restoration. And this kind of activity is quite penetrative and can lead to a really deep imaginative engagement with place. You might try it out sometime, in a place, what the ampliative imagination might look like for yourself. It does involve these forms of visualizing, but other kinds of sensory experience, which can enable us to engage with entirely new standpoints on a place. And this imagining will always be guided by perception. So in that sense, it will be reined in. It won't be just fantasy. I have an image here that I found on Grist, which tries to imagine the United States affected by global climate change and what it's going to look like from region to region. And down where I live in Texas, I live in East Central Texas, people tend to think of it as a really dry and like tumbleweed, the desert landscape. And it's like that in West Texas, where you see, but they've represented Texas really awash with hurricanes. And of course, that is going to be the case further in the south and in the east. And already, of course, we're seeing extreme weather events of frequency in the southern part of the United States along the Gulf Coast, and horrific hurricanes like Katrina and Harvey more locally, which I still hear about from people here who weren't even as directly affected as people were in places like Houston. But I also want to say something here about imagination. And when I was speaking to the glaciologist, one of the things that he said to me was, a lot of the glaciologists now are doing lots and lots of modeling, and they're using a lot of representations and images. They're using remote sensing, and they're spending a lot less time in the places themselves doing the field work, which would have been much more the kinds of methods that he was using over the years. He's been doing field work, especially in the earlier days. And so he said to me, he thinks that the current glaciologists may really be losing that visceral place-based experience of change and how much that's important. And so for me, I think we're using imagination and we're using representations and images to imagine our climate futures. But I think, again, I want to bring that back to the power of aesthetic experience to enable us to capture that visceral feeling of place and the kind of changes that may be going on, kind of experiencing that from the inside, as it were. This is my last slide before my summary, so I'll be finishing up in a moment. So I wanted to say something about revelatory imagination, and I'm thinking about subjecting the integrated aesthetic to my critique here has really got me thinking about the role of revelatory imagination. And I think back to Letters to the Ice, and I think back to Mr. Titi's moving letter about Mount Kenya. And it made me think a lot about imagining places and also connecting our local places to the global changes and to other places in that way, that kind of interconnectivity. So revelatory imagination is a really, again, a very penetrative and rich, deep use of imagination, which gives way to new ideas and meanings and understandings, and also values through distinctly aesthetic experiences, new ways of seeing, a kind of close attention that can lead to revelation. And I mean that revelation in a really broad sense. Perhaps a new belief, perhaps a new idea, perhaps a grasping a new understanding, perhaps a new, more metaphysical, kind of existential kind of sense, vivifying and opening out certain kinds of cosmological ideas about how we're connected to places that are disappearing, how we're connected to the atmosphere that's being depleted. And I think revelatory imagination can also reveal the horror and the suffering of humanity in the natural world through human evil, through natural disasters, and strike the imagination in ways that spread meaning more deeply, and in ways that can, of course, make our aesthetic experiences really quite challenging and quite difficult. Not to forget, again, the negative aesthetic experiences which are going to populate so much of our future aesthetics, but not all. There is still room for beauty, I believe. So I do want to ask that question, how might revelatory imagination function to reveal what our aesthetic futures hold? Again, I think Letters to the Ice provide some really interesting ways to think about this. All right, so just in summary, how do we move forward with this theory? How is it looking related to the critique I've subjected it to? Well, I think, the senses, perception, knowledge, emotions, imagination are integral to aesthetic experience of environment and place. That's still the case. Pluralistic, yes, I think it's a pluralistic theory, but it needs to embrace global aesthetics and narratives much, much more so than it originally did, given environmental changes on a global scale. And I think this can also make our aesthetic theories and environmental aesthetic theories much more inclusive. It needs to incorporate intergenerational and future aesthetics, temporality, longer timescales than the original kinds of changes envisaged, which were more like seasonal changes. And I think, again, imagination can help us here, and also descriptive aesthetics. Descriptive aesthetics can help us to capture past, present, and future climate scenarios and other forms of environmental change. Now, some things I haven't talked about very much in this talk, but I do talk a bit more about in the paper on aesthetics and climate change that's forthcoming. Negative aesthetics is going to have a larger role to play. We find in descriptive aesthetics, these apocalyptic scenarios, but we also have to understand, adaptation and mitigation and kinds of a technology that's going to be populating our planet more and more, and different kinds of technology in relation to adaptation. So negative aesthetics, but also not to forget the positive aesthetics and moving forward. And finally, I haven't said anything about this, but I'm thinking more about it in a couple other papers. I do write about, have already written about aesthetics and ethics, but I need to do this more, I think, in relation to our changing futures. But thinking about aesthetics, ethics, and geopolitics and how they interact, how they overlap, where they come into conflict. And that's really going to need a deeper understanding of the relationship between these three. And I mentioned geopolitics too, because of the way in which governance is so central to our climate futures, and how those geopolitics relate to the local and to the global, and so on and so forth. Okay, well, thank you for listening, and I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Emily, for this brilliant talk. Thank you. Thank you very much, really, for accepting our invitation, because really it makes sense at the end, almost at the end of our journey through these seminars. And we have the possibility, thanks to this talk, to go back to some concepts and issues we have already explored in the other seminars from another perspective, a different perspective. So it was really, really interesting also for the students that are online from my own course. So thank you very much again. Now we have, we have a question and answer session. So please, if there are questions, I've already explained how you can just ask your questions. Either you can write in the chat, or you can just use this functional Webex with the small icon in form of a hand and just ask your question quite directly to Professor Brady. I know that my students have a question or questions, so in case if they want to break the ice, they can just start with their own questions. Okay, Mario has a question. Mario Crispino is one of the students here from the Department of Philosophy. So yeah, listen to the student's question. Please, Mario.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I have two questions. The first one is a general question about descriptive aesthetic, and the second one is about rewilding that you address in your paper. So I'll go with the first one. No one will ever be able to have first-hand aesthetic experience of all places or species at risk of extinction. Nowadays, we experience these natural realities through documentaries, books, scientific divulgation, and in general, also thanks to the descriptive aesthetics. So my question is, don't you think is there a risk that descriptive aesthetics could be used ironically by paradox to minimize man's negative impact on the planet, since environmental beauty and diversity will continue to be seen in films, books, and other artworks? And can I go with the second question? Okay. What if knowing that natural space has been reconstituted by humans is a reason to enjoy it less? I mean, for example, knowing that a group of trees was planted in a specific spot by, let's say, a landscape architect who followed an artificial pattern, perhaps diminishes the possibility of enjoying the landscape. And maybe this is a problem that can affect future generations as well. Thank you.
Okay. You were breaking up a little bit on my end, so I hope I captured your questions correctly. The first question, yes. So in relation to descriptive aesthetics, we can, what's so funny, I was thinking, one of the things I didn't say about environmental aesthetics is that preferably it's firsthand. But of course, descriptive aesthetics can give us, play a role in relation to that which isn't firsthand, because there, as you point out, there will be a lot that we cannot experience firsthand. But there are many rewilded landscapes that we can already experience firsthand, actually, and reintroductions that have created new ecologies in places like Yellowstone because of the reintroduction of wolves. And there are other examples. So those places can be experienced firsthand, but there are many that cannot. So in the paper on aesthetics and global climate change, I talk about the descriptive aesthetics in relation to, I also talk about aesthetic testimony, which is a concept that philosophers use. And in that respect, we do need to adjudicate between forms of testimony, right? So just in the way that we may be adjudicating between aesthetic judgments, or adjudicating between different interpretations of art, say, you know, in a critical sense. In the original book in 2003, I talk about a kind of critical interpretive lens for thinking about aesthetic judgments, and I talk about a kind of intersubjectivity as opposed to a kind of pure subjectivity or pure relativism or anything like that. So I think I'd probably say the same thing, that we probably will need to be critically interpretive between different kinds of aesthetic testimony, recognizing, yeah, the anthropomorphizing, the sentimentalizing, the trivializing, that which isn't factual. So these are all ways in which I think our aesthetic experiences, and in ways that many environmental aestheticians have tried to argue for how we might adjudicate between more appropriate or more inappropriate. I don't really like to use those terms. My students always like go, oh, that sounds awful. What do you mean appropriate aesthetic judgment? Well, it really just means appropriate to what it is that you're appreciating. You know, if we're talking about the appreciation of a snowdrop, we need to think about what it is to appreciate that particular flower and not something else in that particular setting. And in response to your second question, now I knew I was going to forget what it was. Can you repeat it, please? My apologies. That's the problem. I probably need to answer them one by one. Quickly, Mario. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I got the gist of the question. The question was like, when we know that the human intervention was fundamental in order to restore or rewild, do we appreciate less in a way, or what's the effect on the aesthetic appreciation of the place, for instance?
Yeah, of course.
Right. Yeah, thank you.
What if knowing that natural space?
Okay, Mario. Okay, we're okay. Okay, I've already given Emily a resume of your question.
Okay, alrighty. So yes, of course. I think we can talk about certainly the range of environments. We can talk about natural environments. We can talk about modified environments. More recently, I've written a co-authored book on modified environments. So yeah, thinking a lot about the ways in which humans modify environments in different kinds of ways, for the better and for the worse, certainly. In rewilding, humans, compared to ecological restoration, or rewilding as a type of ecological restoration, but in rewilding, there's a more autonomous role for nature. There's originally human modification, human ways in which we change things, but then nature really left to rewild itself, as it were. But also, of course, gardens and design, designed landscapes and agriculture. If we're talking about damaged environments, if that's, I'm not sure if you were quite asking that, or a more general question about, I don't think that because an environment's been modified by humans that it necessarily has some negative aesthetic value. I don't take that view. However, if we do understand that ecology has been harmed in some way or damaged in some way, perhaps it's an invasive species that humans have introduced, and that's changed and destroyed much of the ecology, for example. And then we may take, our aesthetic experience may be dampened by that. When I've written about this previously, what I've said is that, I follow some other philosophers who argue that, this knowledge of damage doesn't dictate the aesthetic result, but it may introduce new emotions into the experience. If the damage is really awful, if the harm is so awful, It may be that we simply cannot do that. We cannot face that aesthetic appreciation anymore, that we pull back and we turn away. But I certainly don't want to make any more general claim that a damaged environment is always aesthetically inferior in some way. Yeah, good question.
Thank you. Okay, I see that there is another question. Someone has raised the hand, so please. I see in the chat. The name in the list of participants is 47. Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Sophie Habur from Germany. Thank you very much for your fascinating lecture. So my question is rather ontological. How, in broad terms, could the aesthetic perspective on disappearance and destruction of negative aesthetics be linked to the ontological question of what it means for something to irreversibly disappear? So, for example, glaciers and animal species. So my suspicion is that we have not yet come to grips the disappearance of elements of the environment, either aesthetically or conceptually, and neither ontologically. How do you see it?
Yes, it's an interesting question. I hope I have grasped it correctly. I do write, I suppose, more about this in the Aesthetics and Climate Change paper. Both papers I published, but I think part of my motivation in writing about aesthetics and climate change, I mean, again, I recognize it's been written about in very much more in other disciplines, in art sci collaborations and eco-criticism, but the latest paper on aesthetics and climate change is kind of a plea to my discipline to say, look, we need to be thinking about this more. So that's my kind of step in that direction, or a couple steps. So, I mean, I suppose I see the role of aesthetics as trying to capture what it is we're going to lose and playing an important role in that. But also in doing what philosophers I think do well is like thinking about, not making assumptions that it is going to all be negative, that there is going to be beauty, that there is hope for that, and not to make assumptions in that direction, to try to think about where that beauty might be held, and not again to kind of only assume this kind of apocalyptic scenario. Yeah. And I say that with credentials, which is to say I have written plenty on negative aesthetics. I am now actually thinking I need to write a little bit more about positive aesthetics because I think that, well, I can't answer that question right now. It's a big one. But I think ontologically speaking, okay, yeah. So then again, I think I talk about how do you capture loss? How do you think about loss from a philosophical standpoint, from an aesthetic standpoint? I think we can talk about ruins, and some of the really interesting work, recent work. We can talk about work on the role of history, kind of, and sort of historical losses, and change and temporality. I think that's where those concepts come in again. Sorry, there's one more thing I was going to say, but it's escaping me. I think I could give you a better answer to that question, so please feel free to email me because I should probably stop there for the moment.
Yeah, thank you. It would be my next project to get a combination of ontological questioning and aesthetic questioning. I think might be a gap nowadays.
Yes.
Okay, so wonderful. I will send you an email.
Please.
Well, thank you. Are there any questions? I mean, just want to say a couple of things. We have discussed in one of the last seminars this question of either a positive aesthetics or a negative aesthetics, in the sense of we had here a science communicator and we asked him, like, what's the most effective way to make people act against climate change? Is to frighten them or to give them hope that something can change? Because actually, it really changed everything. And of course, the question is a mixture of both, because just to frighten people, perhaps, is not exactly the way. And you need some optimism that thinks that some beauty can be still there and that we can restore it, we can restore the beauty, we can have also beauty in the future. So I mean, a mixture of them. And if there are no other questions at the moment, I want you to ask a question actually, which has to do with one of the problems in making people aware of climate change and ecological crisis, which is the fact that we habituate ourselves to anything. So we get habituated to change very soon, very fast, so that it's difficult for us as human beings to appreciate how things have changed and how beautiful it would be to stay with things as they were in the past. And I would like to ask you, what do you think is the role of this habitual layer or habitual dimension of aesthetic experience in this big discussion about the aesthetics of climate change, the aesthetic of the Anthropocene? Do you think that does this habitual dimension of our experience as human affect how we should conceive of the experience of beauty in the Anthropocene? Do you think that it plays a role, or yeah, what?
Could you say more about what you mean by this habitual experience,
Yeah,
Marita?
I had in mind like these psychological phenomenon that we call like the shifting baseline syndrome, that we get simply habituated to anything. Like, I don't know, a couple of years ago, I was in Scotland in the summer and it was incredibly warm. And okay, it was like 25 degrees and it was absolutely unusual in July in Edinburgh. But we slowly get habituated. It is still okay that in July in Scotland, because it's warm and I feel good, but it's not good, of course, because something is changing and it's changing for the worse, not for the better. And yeah, I would say, I would like to know, what do you think about this, habits and aesthetic experience?
Yeah, God, that's a challenge. That's a really challenging question, because of course it relates to how we change people's behavior, um, which of course is so important now. But gosh, I think I remember one of my colleagues years ago, John O'Neill, saying to me, what about people just getting used to, this huge super quarry that they wanted to create, dig in Harris, the Isle of Harris in Scotland. And, what if people just got used to that new look of the mountain that was just gouged, that was no longer that mountain. They got used to it, lots of jobs. And so it was kind of okay. Um, and so maybe really think a lot about that, how people might get used to aesthetic changes and how do you really address that? And I suppose there's a couple ways. I think one is through the kind of work that artists can do in place-based kind of work, where working, and the way local communities can work with themselves to just kind of really understand what those changes are that are happening. So it's not a matter of getting used to, it's a matter of like, look at what effects we are having and how are we going to be living in the future? And what future do we want? That kind of, and where does aesthetics play a role in that? Well, it plays a role by bringing people into those places and maybe enabling a particular kind of valuing and finding meaning in that place that maybe has not been found before. And back in that case of the Harris super quarry, it was never built, constructed, but there was some discussion about how the whole process, which was a long planning process, did create a particular kind of awareness of the place that would have been, parts of it would have been destroyed through the super quarry, and also changed because of the kind of infrastructure and traffic and so on. So I think that kind of more place-based kind of combination of aesthetic, artistic, environmental, educative awareness. But I have to say that moving from a place like Scotland, which has a very progressive climate politics, relatively speaking, to a place like Texas, you really, and I'm generalizing, but what I see where I live in a college town, when I come here, I think there's absolutely no hope because of people's habits, because of the habits that are so ingrained here. And when I used to teach climate ethics, I would use the US as an example when I lived in the UK, and now I'm living that example. And so, you can talk about ways in which we can create new habits of aesthetic habits and new understandings, but I think it's a big challenge because people are so different and living different realities, and we know that there are a lot of habits that are really hard to change. So sorry to end on a very negative note, but I guess that's where we are.
Yeah, that's where we are. That's true. Are there any other questions? Would you like to ask questions? No? Okay, because I have a couple of students here with me in the classroom, and other students I know that are connected online. Okay, I can see, no, there are no questions in the chat. Okay, that's great. Okay, if there are no other questions, I think that we can all say thank you to you. Really, thank you very much for this brilliant presentation. It was really a pleasure to have you in this series of seminars. And let's hope the next time we can see and meet each other in presence here in Florence, because the first time you missed a chance to come to Italy last September, and let's hope that it will happen soon. But for now, for this online experience, thank you very much for your time and again for accepting our invitation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for this. Thank you so much.
Great. And I want to tell to all the participants that the recording of this talk will be available on the YouTube channel of the University of Florence. So I'll forward to you the link so that we can take track of these seminars thanks to our YouTube channel. Thank you very much, Emily, and let's hope to meet in presence soon. Thank you. Bye. Thank you to all the participants. Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.